One. Hey, welcome back to another dispatch from Holly McKay. Holly is just back from Ukraine and has been taking questions in social media from people that want to know things about what she has done. And today we are going to ask some of those questions of Holly. And how are you? And welcome back.
Thank you. I'm doing well. Thank you, Janice.
All right. Okay. So I've got four questions to ask you. It's kind of like pick them at random, or well, not maybe not so random. But so the first one is from Cibello Personal. And the question is, how are people getting the basic necessities like food, water, and medicine? How are the children coping? And what about newborns and babies? Do you think those mothers will leave Ukraine? Can they leave safely?
Well, I'll answer the last part first. I might have to get you to repeat. But mothers and babies can leave. There are certainly, again, it depends exactly where you're living because living somewhere like Lviv or even Kiev is going to be much more simple than living somewhere in Donbass, for example. But mothers and babies, they can leave the country. Trains are still working for across much of the country. That sort of hasn't been interrupted too much as a result of the conflict. Of course, roads are kind of back open in many areas that aren't sort of under bombardment. So you've got different options. There's buses as well. So mothers and babies can still leave the country. And again, it depends where you're located, but with sort of relative safety. Those sort of transport arteries of recent haven't been targeted, knock wood. So they can leave and go to places like Poland is sort of the primary place. So you've got Hungary, Moldova, and those countries are still taking in refugees. So to answer that question in a short way, yes, they can leave safely. It's difficult, but they can.
And necessities getting in? That's the other part of the question.
Again, it's so dependent on where you live. So the interesting part with Ukraine is a lot of the country has gone back to a sort of a relative new normal or a new normal. So in sort of the major cities like Odessa, like Lviv, like Kiev, things are reopened again. Businesses are sort of back functioning, at least during the day. There are curfews at night, but they're much later now. They used to be, I believe it's 10 p.m. So you can sort of go out. Schools are sort of reopened. Things are again, it's not sort of what it was like in January of 2022, but it has sort of started up again, and life is sort of fairly normal. And in that sense, logistical supplies are coming in. Of course, it's a little bit more difficult than it used to be, just because there isn't operating airfields, and the airports aren't open, but things can come in by road. So there certainly isn't the shortage of sort of medicines that there was in that first couple of months of war when things really just shut down, especially in the capital. But if you're looking at Donbass, it's sort of a very different scenario. It's sort of a lot harder to sort of get in and out. It's much harder to take supplies. But again, those arteries are sort of still open with challenges, and supplies can get in. It's much more difficult, much more slower. And of course, a lot of the medical supplies are being reserved for the military and for those fighting. So it does make it a little bit harder for civilians to be able to get the things that they need. But I think Ukraine is doing its best to ensure that the people living there sort of have the best possible access to healthcare that you can in a time of war.
Okay, well, there you go. That's actually a very comprehensive answer to that question. Let's do the next question. Uh, I'm gonna garble the name here. Lil Honduran 4. Um, the present re the present relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine. Do you think long-term spending is what Americans will commit to?
This is a difficult question because I think, we're looking at 8 months into the war now. I think that Americans are, for the most part, the support for Ukraine has been a very much a bipartisan issue. It's really just kind of a fringe group of people that are very kind of anti or a little bit more isolationist in their approach. But for the most part, both Republicans and Democrats largely support Ukraine. I think sort of the predominant sentiment across the U.S. too is support for Ukraine. However, I caveat that with there are certainly more fringe groups of people who don't support, but the majority speaking, they still do. But I do think it is a problem that could, especially looking at 2023, it could be problematic because we are, in the US and certainly in Europe too, you're dealing with astronomical inflation, you're dealing with rising gas prices, which really does affect the EU a lot, especially going into winter. And eventually people are going to perhaps to start to look at that and say, well, why am I paying billions in and my taxpayer dollars to this sort of country that's far away when I'm struggling to put food on the table at home? And of course, lawmakers they have to sort of impress their local constituencies. And if that is going to become an issue, then we may start to see that shift where that support just isn't there the way that it was. And I think once things start to fade, once conflicts recede from the headline, that is when there is sort of questionable amounts of support. And as it stands, the White House is still sending billions and has asked Congress for, I think it's another $34 billion package to Ukraine, which could take some time to come through. But those things, it may start to wither. It's very hard to predict. I think it was General Milley said the other day that winter tends to bring a little bit of a stalemate on both sides of the conflict because it's sort of such brutal conditions. Maybe a good time for negotiations, and then that sort of I think attracted the ire of Kyiv, and the White House kind of walked it back in saying that why should Ukraine have to give up any inch of its territory, which we can all certainly relate to appease an invader. But then at the same time, how long can the sort of the weapons flow continue for the fight to continue without some sort of deal on the table? So it's very hard to say, but we may see a withering, come in the next few months, if not, 6 months to a year.
Yeah, well, I'll reserve my opinions on that because it's your interview. But good points, definitely good points. This is definitely something to watch, particularly in 2023, because political conditions in the U.S. are about to change drastically in terms of the balance of power. So we'll see. Next question, Gilia Delmore or Delmore. I'm not sure how you pronounce the name, but is there progress being made on the ground, or is it a stalemate to maintain the ground they have?
If you look at a map, I mean, now in beginning of December, end of November, um, Russia actually controls less territory than it did in sort of March, April, when they had Kherson, which was the big city, and they had a lot of these sort of surrounding areas. So Ukraine has not only been able to go on the defensive, but they've gone on the offensive in many cases and actually sort of taken back terrain that Russia had gained. So you're looking at a conflict that is sort of largely reduced to the east as it was from 2014, but sort of an expanded area. And then you sort of throw in this caveat that occasionally Moscow will fire missiles into Lviv and Odessa and Kyiv just to kind of target infrastructure and to sort of try to assert their authority, which is something that we didn't have before the February invasion. But for the most part, the sort of the majority of the bombardments and sort of the intensity of the conflict, if you will, is very much sort of refined to that eastern area and areas sort of outside the control. I mean, Ukraine, the pro-Russian separatists, if you will, it's sort of those areas outside that sort of Sofia that I guess are under the most heavy shelling and bombardment. So in some ways, yes, it's a stalemate. In other ways, you sort of see a little bit of a tug forward and backward. I will say in the area that I was particularly in, with a group named the Mozart Group, was in Bakhmut, and that is sort of being a major focus of bombardment by the Russians, and specifically the Wagner Group, which is the private military company that sort of does a lot of the heavy lifting for Moscow. But that, on the surface, it may not seem like a sort of a strategic hub, but in taking, if Russia, and they are gaining ground in Bakhmut, and that's also not really what's being reported, because journalists aren't getting in there, and I think Ukraine really wants to sort of maintain its sort of high morale. But the reality that I see on the ground is that Russia really is gaining some traction in Bakhmut, and if they were to take Bakhmut, and they're just outside of it, that sort of gives them a much sort of stronger thoroughfare to move further forward to Krumstorf and other places. So it is a stalemate to some degree, but then there are sort of shifts and ebbs and flows in who controls territory and what. And it should be still a big cause for concern. The other concern that I think is that when we're sort of championing the response of Ukraine, but I think that can lead to complacency. And so it also needs to be emphasized that this is a war that's far from won, and that Russia still has the ability to continue to sort of move forward and take other places. And you look at somewhere like Mariupol, we hear very little about Mariupol anymore. And that has been under Russian control now since March. So it is sort of a lot, I think, that is not being, sort of fully fleshed out in the media, if you will.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's kind of an interesting situation here where the Russian military proper has been, you got to hand it to the Ukrainians. They used the summer well and they interrupted the logistics of them. And now that the Russians are really back to using mercenary contractors as their way to get through the winter, that kind of goes back to the pattern of since 2014 when that was kind of there. So it's does that mean it's a stalemate, or does that, I don't know, but basically the situation on the ground is not, has kind of gone back to pre-war. And so from an analytical perspective, you could say that the big push to topple the Kiev government failed completely. And so that's, I chalk that one up as a win for them. But yeah, that one's going to be one to watch as well, because can the Ukrainians take out the Wagner group? That's kind of the next big question that's kind of on my mind from a strategy standpoint. But we will learn, and when something breaks, I'm pretty sure you'll probably go back and check on it, won't you?
We'll have to see. Hope so.
Yeah, there you go. All right, let's go for the last question here. Amanita Glass. Why aren't more countries coming to the defense of Ukraine? I understand it could potentially make the situation worse, but it feels like the world is sitting back and watching Ukraine get steamrolled.
Well, I wouldn't say Ukraine is getting steamrolled, because they've certainly put up an incredible fight. I think most countries, at least on a vocal level, have come to the defense of Ukraine. Very few countries will kind of, support Russia in any sort of the UN sort of resolutions, and they're countries that are typically not countries to be concerned about. You can get North Korea and Syria and sort of very minor players there. And then you've got other players like China that may abstain, and India that, are concerned about their own deals with Russia. But I think for the most part, I really do think the majority of countries have come to the defense of Ukraine, at least sort of vocally, in standing out against them. We can argue the degrees to which that support has actually any effect or been administered in any way. But I think that all sort of checks and balances aside, Ukraine isn't a NATO member. It's applied for NATO membership, and it's not in the EU either. So that does create it does make it more challenging for NATO countries and for the United States to sort of fully get behind Ukraine. If it was a NATO country, that would be a completely different scenario. But the reality is that it's not. So I think really in a case like this, the US has sort of two options, and the big sort of factor in the middle of it is nuclear weapons. So if Russia didn't have a big arsenal of nuclear weapons, I think that we may have seen a much bigger and bolder response from many countries, especially in Europe, to the conflict. But the fact of the matter is countries are staying out because of that nuclear arsenal, and we can call it nuclear blackmail, we can call it whatever we sort of want, but that is the reality. Is nobody wants to see sort of a nuclear conflict, which could certainly bring about the deaths of millions, if not you or I. So I think that is the big deciding factor. In the US, really, I mean, could sort of take two strategies with this, and that would be to either go guns blazing and go in and take that nuclear risk, Just the way that the US went into Afghanistan and took out the Taliban in sort of a matter of weeks. And then it was sort of the fumbling in the 20 years after that led to the situation now. But if we remember in the beginning, that wasn't hard. And the US has the power and the ability to absolutely go in and I think crush Russia in a very short period of time if it wanted to do that. But that option really just hasn't been on the cards because of that nuclear option and because Ukraine is not subject to the NATO treaty. So yeah, I think sort of the skirting around that is to be able to supply weapons to Ukraine for now, and we'll have to see how it develops from here.
Yeah. Well, just a quick follow-up question to that. Why do you think some people have the impression that Ukraine is not as supported as it actually is politically in the world?
I'm not sure. I really think that in a time of war, and I see this in every conflict I cover and in people that are under immense suffering. They'll always tell you, and in some cases it's accurate, but they'll always tell you, this atrocity is happening and the world is silent. Or, something's happening here and nobody's paying attention. And I think often cases, that is the case with many conflicts in countries that we don't hear a lot about. But certainly in the case of Ukraine, that isn't true. I mean, an absolute sort of deluge of journalists have been in there since the beginning. It's wall-to-wall coverage, really, like nothing I'd ever seen. I mean, it's dimmed a lot now, but in those first few months, it really was covered, I think, much more than even Iraq and Afghanistan were back when the US was directly involved. So I don't think that is sort of the case, but I think when you are suffering and when you are in a time of war and when you're seeing awful things happen to your home, your loved ones, to the country that you love, and nothing sort of concrete stopping it, it's a very natural reaction to sort of feel that that nobody cares or the world is silent and no one's doing anything about it because maybe nobody sort of can't sort of fix the problem immediately, but that doesn't mean people aren't aware, and that doesn't mean countries aren't sort of there behind the scenes or diplomatically doing what they can. But I do think it's something that I see and hear a lot, and it is just sort of a natural reaction to pain and trauma, is to feel that you're going through something that is completely unjust, and yet nobody can stop it, and that is it's a difficult concept to grapple with.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think people, just your final impression here, people don't understand it. Some wars take forever. I mean, you've covered Myanmar, and that place has been in conflict for what? Since the end of World War II, right?
Since 1940, I mean, I always say 19, a lot of these conflicts, they started in 1948, with the end of World War II, and there's many places that have been sort of in this sort of a ebb and flow state of war, really since
Yeah.
then.
Yeah, technically, if you go look at the Ukrainian history, it kind of started in 1936. And that's a perspective, and a perspective that I think we could cover at another time. But those are the questions that were asked of you today. So thank you, Holly, for taking the time to answer them, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.